welcome everybody to our GARS and EAC webinar today, which is called Aviation and the Environment, the SAF Solution. We have two speakers today, Martin Adler and Steph Prost, and I'm Anna Straubinger. I'm together with Bill Hemmings, heading the working group Aviation and the Environment at the German Aviation Research Society. And this is also why we set up this webinar today, and we hope that this is going to be the first in a series of webinars on the topic of aviation and the environment. So we'll be recording this session for everybody who's not able to join due to time restrictions. So we hope that that's okay for everyone. If you don't want to be on video, so you might want to switch off your video if you have it switched on, and otherwise, well, you're also free to access the recording afterwards. We also have a chat that you can use to ask questions. We'll try and gather some clarifying questions along the way during the presentations. And for all discussion questions, I would ask you to, or we would like to talk about them afterwards. I'll start off with a short introduction about what we're planning to cover today. I'll give a short introduction to the topic of sustainable aviation fuels that I guess many of you are familiar with. And then I'll hand it over to our speakers, who will both give a short input, and then we'll go forward to the discussion. And you're free to ask your questions to, well, steer the discussion in a way that is also most interesting for you. Okay. So let's kick this off. Our speakers today are Martin Adler. He's a senior researcher at SEO. He's researching in the fields of transport and urban economics, and he's mainly specialized in the topic of aviation and sustainability. He's actually been working on the Fit for 55 regulation and Destination 2050. So I think he's very well suited to contribute to our discussion today. He's been quite actively advising, for example, OECD, but also the European Parliament and the Commission. And I think he's a great addition to our panel today. Besides Martin, we also have Steph Prost on our panel. He's an emeritus professor at the Faculty of Economics and Business at KU Leuven, and he's also co-founded the Transport and Mobility Center there. He also does research in the fields of transport, but also environmental economics. And he's specifically working on topics around optimal pricing, investments, public transport, but also, of course, aviation. And this is how he fits into our panel today. And I think both speakers can very well contribute with their complementary competencies on our discussion today. And I'm looking forward to that, and happy that we were able to have them on board for our first webinar in our series. So I hope that I don't have to really motivate this topic for you. I hope that many of you are familiar with the topic. Well, we all know that aviation has a huge climate impact, and that CO2 emissions from aviation make up, well, around about 3.5% of human-made CO2 emissions. And well, we all know that compared to, for example, road transport, well, CO2 emissions in aviation and the climate impact of aviation is exceptionally hard to abate, because, well, we can't just put an electric engine into our aircraft, especially for long haul. But it's not only CO2 that we're concerned with, or that we should be concerned with. It's also, well, other effects. So we're looking at non-CO2 effects that make up approximately 2/3 of the climate impact of aviation. And we also see studies out there that suggest that approximately 5.6% of global warming in 2018 can be or has been induced by aviation. And all of this is to be seen in the context of ever-increasing demand that we see for the aviation sector. I think that is especially pressing, as we know that tendencies like rising middle class in some parts of the world are going to further increase demand. And I think this is a pressing issue, and I think this is something that will further have an impact on what we see happening, especially demand-wise. And one of the measures that is often being discussed and how to mitigate the climate impact of aviation is actually sustainable aviation fuels. I quite like the figure that I put here on the right. It's from FAA, and we see that actually they see, well, along with operations improvements and with technological improvements and fleet renewal, they actually see sustainable aviation fuels as the main lever to reach net zero for the aviation sector by 2050. And well, we know that different countries and different regions across the globe have different approaches, but I think it is very, very interesting that we see, well, SAF to be one of the prominent ways out of our issue that we have in aviation and the climate impact of aviation. And what we want to discuss today is whether or not SAF is actually able to achieve what we see in this figure here, and what it is often promoted to be able to do. So let me start by giving a short overview about the current, well, global but also European measures to mitigate aviation's climate impact. Well, I guess a lot of you are familiar with it, but we'll nevertheless go over it briefly. So we know we have the emission trading scheme in Europe, where CO2 emissions are basically under a cap. And we are trading allowances for emissions. But concerning the aviation sector, this only actually tackles intra-EU flights. Then for all other flights, we have CORSIA, where airlines are required to offset emissions above the 2019 levels. It is a huge achievement because it's actually the first global market-based measure that is out there. But we have to be aware of that CORSIA is actually not binding on states, and that CORSIA is actually also only imposing small or low costs on the airlines for emissions. Then there's the possibility to have fuel taxes, but we actually don't see many fuel taxes internationally, so that doesn't really come into play here. And then we have the topic of sustainable aviation fuels. It is a topic under the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, where we have strong incentives for SAF production via tax credits. And well, now under Refuel EU, we have a SAF blending mandate for all flights taking off at European airports. And by 2025, the regulation foresees a 2% blending mandate, and up to 2050, it's 70% SAF on all flights leaving the EU. And within this blending mandate, there's a sub-quota for e-fuels, which is also going to increase over time. But now back to the topic of our webinar today. Is SAF really the solution? So we know that SAF is going to have a lower life cycle CO2 emission compared to conventional jet fuel, depending on what kind of sustainable aviation fuels we're talking about. It's 60 to 80% reduction possibility. But the question we want to discuss today is whether the commitments that the EU has done in the Green Deal, that we want to reach 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, is that actually possible to reach using SAF? And is SAF actually able to mitigate the climate impact despite ever increasing demand that we see? Then we want to briefly touch upon the topic of current SAF prices being pretty high, and if we have a blending mandate on them, who's going to pay for it? And how efficient is it to actually mitigate aviation's climate impact via SAF policies? Would other policies probably be more appealing? And then we also want to talk about how the European blending mandate currently regulates fuel suppliers, airports, and aircraft operators. But what does that mean? Is that actually going to work? Are we going to see sufficient production of SAF and synthetic fuels? So explicitly talking, well, by 2030, we're going to need about 2.3 million tons of SAF. And currently, we only have 10% production forecasted. So how is that going to work? What incentives do we need for producers, and how much certainty do producers need? And then the last topic we're going to cover is, well, how does it work logistic-wise? We need infrastructure, we need delivery to airports, and that is something we want to briefly touch upon as well. But now, without further ado, I want to hand over to the first speaker, and I'll give the floor to Martin, who's going to present some of his thoughts on the topic.
Thank you, Anna, for inviting me here as a speaker and also to the GARS members. It's a great pleasure to talk about something which I've been researching in the last 2.5 years intensely. Thank you. In SEO Amsterdam Economics, maybe if you can immediately go to the next slide, Anna, that would be great. Like SEO Amsterdam Economics is a relatively small consultancy, or like about 60 economists within the Netherlands. And most of our work is done practically on a national level. We have an aviation department which has been operating for more than 20 years and has a relatively good standing in terms of the research which is promoting. Within this context, I'm going to now talk about what you see here is the last 4 or 5 years of work which we have been doing on this topic. Not all of it, but a select number of articles which we have been written. I have been involved in the 4 out of 5. I wasn't involved in the original Destination 2050. This was my some of my colleagues who have by now left the SEO Amsterdam Economics. These are usually reports which are industry financed, but we produce independent research, so that practically we do not take on board what the industry wants, but we report on our findings as is. What you can see, the original Destination 2050, and I assume some of you are going to be aware of this, was an approach by the industry to maybe preempt some of the regulation which was upcoming in the late 2020s. And so the stakeholders, among them practically CANSO, ASD, the A4E, so particularly the airlines, the aircraft manufacturers, they all came together and they hired SEO Amsterdam Economics together with NLR, which most of this researchers with. So this is the Aerospace and Aviation Research Institute of the Netherlands. It's government funded. It's similar to the DLR, which probably a lot of you are going to be familiar with. I think they are partner organizations even. And so it looked into measures which would be possible, or pillars, what it is called, which would allow aviation to decarbonize by 2050. And those are 4 pillars, one of them being technology, the other one operations, then sustainable aviation fuels and economics. The follow-up report later was the price of net zero, where we're talking about the total cost and investments needed to achieve this. I'm going to go through the findings in a bit of most of those reports. I'm going to practically highlight accordingly on how we should understand the role of SAF and practically the involved economics. Then in regards to this, but still somewhat separate, we looked at the price of Fit for 55, because Destination 2050 has a different set of measures and are more practically maybe aligned with what Anna was showing with the FAA, how they see it, so practically also involving technology, also involving ops, in contrast to the Fit for 55 policy. So practically we also analyze what is the total cost of Fit for 55, and then can contrast it in a second to cost and investments. What we also look at is what is the competition effects, or practically what do we see when we introduce Fit for 55, how do our airlines and airports affect it differently? And we also have a paper which we might wrap up in the discussion about the EU ETS expansion, which is not practically currently agreed on, but is in the discussion should CORSIA fail in its current form or not proceed as fast as wished for. And if you don't mind, maybe put the next slide. I'm going to briefly show you, so all of this work is based on, or the majority of the work which we're showing is based on modeling. Some of it is more of like, let's say, accountancy measures or counting measures, but a lot of this is involves modeling of the aviation market. It's based on a passenger choice model, so practically it's the price of travel and how do passengers react. I'll show you here some of the inputs, but like, it's not about necessarily about looking really into detail, what is the exact price and does this correspond, because the models usually tend to be relatively robust to minor variations in prices. But what you can see is that practically there's, as Anna already mentioned, 4 different pillars within Fit for 55, which play a major role. Refuel EU, practically the SAF blending mandate, is only one part of this. Also keep in mind that practically the SAF blending mandate is practically influenced through which sort of feedstocks can you use. So practically the RED II or the Renewable Energy Directive is practically changing the compositions of what sort of fuels you can use. And I don't know if you can see my cursor actually, but so the lower section of the table on the right, you can see that practically different types of fuels have different prices and different levels of input. Synthetic fuels coming on later, practically having a lower amount, but then ramping up relatively rapidly. That's why I'm also saying there isn't just one SAF mandate, or there is one SAF mandate, but there isn't only one type of SAF. No, SAF is a composition out of various alternative technologies towards producing one fuel, right? Or like, yeah. Noteworthy is also the prices. So you can see here that SAF at the moment or in a few years is quite expensive, especially you consider that these are 2018-19 prices. So practically that it's almost a factor 6 more expensive than the regular Jet A fuel. Now it's a bit less the price difference, but it's still substantial. Even by the year 2050, with full ramp up of all production facilities, you still have probably a factor 3, 2.5, 3 when comparison to normal jet fuel. You see here the cost of other regulation. ETD is currently not passed, so practically this can be maybe ignored. CORSIA, the prices are lower, and practically EU ETS prices, those are relatively up to date. You're going to see now, Anna, if you please will switch to the next slide, you're going to see what we're doing with those assumptions. So practically what we're using those models for is predicting what kind of cost impacts are leading to what kind of flight level changes or like passenger movement changes. And what you can see here is practically CO2 emissions shown from 20, sorry, I'm a bit of a cold, but I hope it's going to be fine. What you can see here is that between 2018 and 2015, what is the composition of CO2 emissions? And you saw that also in the FAA slides, so it's relatively synonymous, but here this is only focused on the European aviation sector. And you can see that without any measures, so we're practically in the reference scenario, but involving already technological improvements, which are regular also without any mandates, you would see due to an increase in demand, you would see also an increase in the emissions. Here we have, of course, the COVID period. Question is, when does it actually end? And then you can see each of the components or the pillars of practically reducing CO2 emissions. And there you can see at the end here, so practically this light blue column or area, the 34% is attributable to SAF. So that's practically the SAF savings in terms of CO2 emissions. And you can see that these are the largest share of those emission savings. And you can also see that additionally, on top of the direct effect of SAF, you also have the indirect effect through the price adjustment. So practically through the more expensive fuel of SAF prices, that it also reduces demand, which otherwise would have taken place. So you can actually say that from that perspective, SAF is one of the key, if not maybe even that key element in reaching net zero by 2050. If you don't mind, Anna, then maybe go to the next slide. Now I'm going to briefly, so this is practically CO2 accounting, if you will, from Destination 2050. Now I'm going to contrast, okay, what does this mean in terms of cost? And we do cost accounting both on the terms of Destination 2050, so what the industry is proposing or what we are practically studied for the industry, and with respect to the Fit for 55 policies alone. On the left-hand side, you see Destination 2050, and it's a lot of information, so please excuse, but I was copy-pasting, and you know how it is, you know. But what's important here is the premium expenditures, right? So left-hand side, and you see, according to this, you see all the premium expenditures which you can practically, which will be necessary between 2018 and 2050. So it includes some of the expenditures which have already occurred, but very few. And you see there that alternative fuels, relatively on the bottom, accounts for 34%, or again, like practically for quite a large share, right, of the expenditures, of the premium expenditures. These are on top on what regular expenditures you would anyways have. So you can see that on the right-hand side, or slightly to the right, in the red circle, you still spend 1 trillion, a bit more than €1 trillion on keeping planes in the air, on renewing the fleet, in terms of ATM improvements, which are already planned, and also in terms of other fuel component. And the other fuel component is practically the component of fuel which you would have anyways bought, but you are now replacing with a more expensive fuel type, right? This is then in addition to another 700, and you can probably not read this, but very small on the bottom as a small note, there would be an additional 730 billion euros of fuel expenditure in that time frame, which you would be tanking in terms of regular jet fuel, right? So they're practically the fuel expenditures, what I want to point out here, of the airline industry in comparison to the other costs are immense, right? And they're going to increase. And then you come to a price tag of a 32-year period of almost 2 trillion euros, and like that tends to be seen as a lot of money. And then you're asking, okay, is this even feasible? What does it mean? And I usually say, okay, look, cost accounting for 32 years is going to end up with a bit of money, but see it in terms of revenue potential of the European aviation industry. And if you look at those numbers, then you're practically comparing this and assuming that you would pass through cost at probably 100% to the consumer, because where to take from if your practically profit margins are very low, then you would probably see a 30 to 40% increase towards current ticket prices. And then all of us have to ask ourselves, okay, what's the problem with this? And then you probably quickly come into the equity considerations, which we're hopefully going to talk about later. But so is it possible? Theoretically, yes, right? With a lot of ifs in terms of technology, and a lot of ifs in terms of, in terms of what needs to happen in terms of regulation. Is it unaffordable? Arguably not. So I think that's a very good sign. Now, if you look into the right-hand side, you see Fit for 55 policies and costs there within. It's about 600 billion euros in the total, and it doesn't correspond one-on-one with Destination 2050 because the assumptions of Destination 2050 are not identical to the ones in Fit for 55. There is, however, some sort of back and forth which is happening maybe between the policy and the Destination 2050, or within the stakeholders, that like there have been, for example, a strengthening of the SAF mandate, which was originally proposed in Destination 2050 and now has found its footing in legislation. You again see here that Refuel EU is the lion's share of those costs, right? And that practically the other policies are supportive, but not practically fully covering this entire time. Anna, if you don't mind, maybe the next slide would be great. I mean, I can, of course, continue talking about this one. There's lots to see, like the little kinks in there are really, really cool, and why practically technological operations, like, or why some of the investments which you have in technology which are past 2040 are not relevant for the 2050 pathway, in the sense of that practically if you do research and development so early, then by 2050 those planes are just not practically flying yet. So we're seeing actually practically now already planes coming online which are going to be flying by the end of this cycle. So maybe let's zoom in for a while. If you look at some of the papers which I earlier shown, and some of also the papers written by other agencies, you will see that there is a relative large consensus around the numbers which are being provided, both on an aggregate level when it comes to cost, but also on a route level. And I think on the route, like on the aggregate level, there's a lot of things happening when you look at the interaction. Also, those policies have interactions, right? Passengers have various ways of how they can react to it. But if you're looking at the route level, and I choose here Hamburg, Bangkok, because it's a long distance flight, you can fly directly. And I want to show a little bit on how practically SAF works. So we fast forward to the year 2035. You see below all the hub airports you can actually fly in through today, right? So excluding maybe St. Petersburg, where it's very difficult to fly through at the moment, or like Moscow, which is also very difficult to fly through at the moment. But let's assume that we're practically pre-war time, pre-Ukraine war times. And you can see that it is especially hubs which are not based within the EEA, so therefore are not within the Fit for 55 policy, which have substantially lower costs which they can offer. So like practically the y-axis is the cost increase for return flights. So you can see that, for example, in Istanbul, due to SAF, which you have to upload until you reach Istanbul, and due to Corsia, which is a more minor cost share, you would practically pay about 8 euros per return ticket extra. This can be for something like Charles de Gaulle or Helsinki, that can be upwards of 55 euros. And you can see also how the other policies are playing a role, and you clearly can identify that it is SAF which is the main price driver of those changes. And then SAF has two effects actually. So SAF practically reduces the emissions which is practically contains, which are then therefore not emitted in another fuel type. And you have through the extra cost demand effect. And you can see here on the right-hand side that there is practically an increase on the locations of CO2 at the locations at airports outside the European Union, because you see then relatively strong increase in demand at those locations, practically with not a suitable or similar sustainability policy. And you can say that some of those gains of CO2 savings are going to be practically leaking towards non-European airports, right? Does this make Fit for 55 a bad policy? I don't believe so at all, but we should be aware that a generally good policy, which Fit for 55 is in order towards reducing CO2, does have competitive distortion effects, which will influence European companies providing certain products. And maybe if you can go to the last slide, Anna. To summarize, from the research I have been involved in, it looks like that SAF is going to be one of the main components into decarbonization of a relatively hard to decarbonize sector, right? Especially if we're talking long distance flights, medium and long distance. So we know that there is going to be an effort towards green flight in terms of electric flight, in terms of hydrogen flight, which is going to be towards from 2040 onwards, but those are going to be relatively short distances. Those short distances are also the ones which don't emit most of the CO2. It's especially the long distances, because CO2 emissions are almost a perfect correlation with the distance which you want to travel. So that SAF on a lot of those flights will remain one of the only options if you want to continue practically offering those services towards decarbonization. While SAF in itself is wonderful, we shouldn't forget that there's a lot of necessary infrastructure adjustments which have not occurred yet, both on the airport side, on the refinery side, in terms of practically how you can tank the aircraft. So there's a lot of things which we haven't seen. Also, we're always talking about indirect land use changes, which happen through SAF. There has been some regulation within RED 2, upcoming RED 3, which is trying to limit this impact, at least on the European scale, but probably not as much on the global scale. We're going to have to see how successful they are. Furthermore, there's renewable energies, which is especially required for power to liquid, which is the later stage, synthetic SAF component, which we don't see online. So practically there's a missing potential for renewable energies. And it's not only how we're going to produce the SAF, but where are you going to get that much renewable energy if you're so far behind, practically, arguably. Then we see that a lot of the strong EU regulation towards SAF, while it's being supported by SAF allowances, we're seeing that there is now being advocacy for lowering those targets or practically redefining the targets. This seems, from my perspective as an economist, not an optimal solution, considering that you're trying to incentivize a sector with a long-term perspective to taking action. If you're going to say like, hey, maybe 2 years before we're not going to do this, I'm a bit doubtful that practically this is the right signal and practically triggers the change which is intended. Furthermore, Corsia remains lackluster at best. It is very problematic that some of the highest CO2 emitters within the world are not part of the agreement, that we're seeing prices which are forecasted to be a factor 3 lower than we had maybe 2 years ago. I don't very much feel that this is going to be or at the moment there is doubts. It is of course very good that there is more members, so there is the good and the bad, and it would be very good if CORSIA could come online as stopping a trade war, which would follow otherwise. We see a lot of policy measures which should have been done, especially if you're thinking about cumulative emissions, for example, air traffic management, and I wish there would be more emphasis on practically, because those are some of the highest efficiency gains you can get. Practically with very little investments, you can do a lot of cumulative CO2 savings. And furthermore, we talk a lot about rail, and I'm usually not very happy when we put rail. So I think that rail is going to play an important role in the energy transition. But if we're talking about flying, it's very difficult to see how a market which is performing at the level which it is under a policy set which has not improved in my lifetime. I don't know, Steph, maybe with a slightly longer perspective, maybe it seems better. I don't know. But my lifetime has been a constant disappointment in the rail sector. So it's very difficult for me to see that rail can be a solution. Thanks a lot, and hope we can grab up some of those topics later.
Yeah, so thanks, Martin, for this interesting overview, I would say. So let's pass it on to Steph, so he can also tell us what he thinks.
Thank you for having this opportunity to discuss this topic. Now, what I'm not going to do is comment on the detailed study results presented by Martin. They're all interesting, and I do not necessarily disagree with them. I'm going to take a rather different approach. I'm going to try to concentrate on what are actually the essentials in the argumentation. I do this based on a study we did a couple of years ago for the European Commission, where I tried to convince them that blending mandates was not a good solution. Despite some argumentation, it was finally, they adopted these blending mandates. Okay, so can I have the next slide? I've been doing this type of policy analysis in many sectors, including the electricity sector, whatever, GARS. Now, it's always important to get the objective and the instrument right. First thing is that the objective is to reach net zero in 2050 in the EU. I say it's the net zero in the EU as a total, and to help decreasing emissions in the rest of the world in a cost-effective and fair way. So this does not mean that we have to reduce emissions in the aviation sector to zero. That's something very different. I'll come back to that. Now, the main instrument that the EU has developed for that, and I think most economists are very happy with that, is that these tradable emission permits. And these tradable emission permits are still not well understood by politicians, by many policymakers. It's very simple. It's a decreasing cap on total emissions every year. The total emissions of power sector, industry, aviation, home heating, and land transport have to go down. Now, I think given that the important thing is to reduce emissions, overall emissions. And with this instrument, you do this at lowest cost. So you do first the reductions that are easiest, okay? The higher cost emitters, they pay via permits, they will wait for a moment. And in addition, what is interesting is that these permits are bankable. What does it mean? Is that in the end, you can now already buy permits for the next 5 years, etc., etc. So there's a lot of flexibility, cost efficiency operations that are possible, that are sustained by the financial market, that makes that you can achieve this net zero at lowest cost. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, Anna, is it okay? Thank you. Now, does it work? the first question, I get a lot of these questions from non-economists that say, yeah, I do not believe. So it's just a magic system. It's just accounting. It doesn't work. It works. Also in the aviation sector. There's excellent work by Fageda and Texido that look at econometrics, look statistically what has happened over the years, and the permits, even when they are grandfathered, because that's another topic of discussion, they work, because even when you receive permits for free, there's still an opportunity cost. You can still sell them. So whenever it's cheaper for you to not use them and sell them, you will do it. And it's clearly demonstrated that the effect is larger for whenever there is an alternative rail solution. Of course, these alternative rail solutions, they exist for European destination, they do not exist for overseas. And there's clearly a larger effect on the low-cost airlines. I hear sometimes stories about, yeah, now it's time that all these low-cost airlines, we're going to punish them, we're going to put some extra. No, it works very well for the low-cost airlines as well. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So, question here is whether these drop-in SAF fuels, bio or e-fuels, are part of the cost-efficient solution. That's for me the crucial question here. Are they part of it or not? My answer is extremely simple. Yes, if they are cheaper than ETS permits. Now, of course, you can only compare things that are comparable. So whenever we discuss SAFs, we should correct them for their remaining carbon content, can be 15% for e-fuels, can be, well, 50%, 80% for biofuels, okay, or fuels based on biomaterial. If they are more expensive, okay, we should not count too much on this type of solution. This why not? Because there are cheaper ways to reach net zero in the EU. Very simple answer. Let me go to the next slide, please. Now, so the EU imposed blending mandates due to, in the end, something like 63% in 2050. And I look carefully into the EU documents, and the argument pro SAFs, if you read them carefully, I just quote, this is needed to arrive at carbon neutral aviation in 2050 and to make sure aviation does its fair share. I'm going to address all these specific comments. And the current prices of kerosene, including ETS permit costs, are insufficient to pay for the supply cost of SAF. Okay, I think these are three statements that are actually wrong. First of all, it is not needed. Net zero can also be reached via other means, and I think here about carbon capture, compensation. You can think about other fuels, could be hydrogen, electricity, more efficient, more fuel-efficient aircraft. Aviation does its fair share via ETS permits. Okay, they buy in the limit expensive ETS permits, so they do their fair share. When SAFs are more expensive than ETS permits, it means they are not cost-effective to reach the overall objective. Now, of course, I know that technological progress is important. We need to not only have high carbon prices in the future, but we also need to support new technologies. Okay, that's something I accept, and I think SAF, as well as more fuel-efficient aircraft, should receive R&D support. Now, my argument against blending is very simple. I think it's just more costly than relying on the ETS mechanism. And this blending also reduces the incentives for other solutions, like more fuel efficiency, hydrogen, etc. And I try to illustrate that with a very simple example on the next slide, please, Anna. Putting you. Okay. Yeah. And the next slide tries to explain. I've been struggling with this argumentation, tries to explain, okay, here it goes. So I'm just going to try a very simple comparison between two instruments to reach the same objective. The objective we want to reach is an emission reduction of 25% in a given year, whatever, and think about the medium term. I can do that in two ways. Let's first start with the blending mandate. The blending mandate, imagine to get this 25% saving, take into account fuel price elasticity of minus 0.5, and an extra production cost for SAF that is carbon neutral that only costs twice as much as kerosene. So here I assume that the SAF is really carbon neutral, which is already a very strong assumption. You can reach this 25.4% reduction. If you see, you can see, I don't know whether you see my mouse, but anyway, we can achieve that by a fuel price increase for airlines, a loss of consumer surplus, okay, whenever the consumers of the air market, aviation market will be close to this fuel price increase. And the gross welfare cost is something like 0.17. If we compare that with the alternative instrument, that's just relying on a permit price of 100 euro, it means actually a higher fuel price, something like 50% higher fuel price. We get, with the price elasticity, we get a minus 25% emission reduction. The fuel price for airlines, of course, goes up by 50%. Consumer surplus, consumers suffer, but there is some tax or permit revenues. Those are not a welfare loss. They can be used for something else. They can be used to decrease any other public expenditures. They can be used for R&D expenditures. They can be used for many things. From the moment I suppose that they're used for useful things, it's not always the case for governments, but that's the assumption I take. If you make the correct computation, you see that this blending story, blending mandate, with these assumptions, costs to society 3 times as much. Now, of course, aviation and lobby groups for SAFs, they will support the blending mandate. Why? Because in the end, they say, okay, the number of consumers will be decreased much less in the case of blending mandate than in the case of a permit price, relying on the permit price. Next slide, please. Okay. Some extra material, of course, we need to discuss also other non-CO2 greenhouse gases. What are the answers? I don't know. I'm not an expert on non-CO2 greenhouse gases. Better fuels, okay. Are SAF much better than kerosene? It's a question. And in the end, I say very simple reasoning states that it's better to burn less fuel in the air. And on that respect, ETS is better than blending. Next question is CORSIA and emissions in the rest of the world. I'm sorry, if I read CORSIA principles or CORSIA regulations, they say SAF is accepted from the moment we save 10% of the kerosene emissions. Sorry, for me, this is not serious. This is not serious. So it will not be accepted by countries that want to take it serious. I still believe that extra efforts by Airbus and Boeing, if Europe wants to do something, there's still a lot of things to be done in aviation technology. And we have one advantage: if we can push a little bit better to more fuel efficient aircraft, we reach actually the whole world, because there is this duopoly. The main producers of aircraft, Airbus and Boeing, can do a lot. And I still believe, like in many other sectors, the technology here really pushed in the correct way can do a lot. Everything, so what I've been saying is based on studies that have been published, and it's on the next the next slides, but it's not so important. So everybody who wants to read can read it there. Thank you.
So thank you very much to both of you. Let's start with our discussion. I think that was very valuable input, and I think it pretty well shows how the discussion around how SAF can actually contribute to mitigating the climate impact from aviation. So probably pretty provocatively asking, what would you suggest? What would both of you suggest is the best policy mix that we could go for? Is it good to support SAF, or should we rather go for a different approach? Maybe I think for Steph, we know what he thinks, but what about Martin? What do you think? Especially now, building upon probably what Steph was discussing just now.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Steph, for like those enlightening slides. I see Steph's argument and I understand how he comes to it, or I hope I do. I understand also why something like this could be attractive. But I think there's a couple of factors which we should keep in mind, which will maybe soften Steph's like strength of argument or his suggestion, which is kind of implicit in what he's presenting. And I think one of the main things is timing. So we are now in 2023. We have until 2050. It's not so much time. I mean, like, it's our lifetime, but like, it's not so much time practically when you're thinking about industrial changes, especially when you're coming to something as highly complex as an aircraft. So what we have seen and what we take into account usually is practically technological improvements. And aircraft have become substantially more efficient over the last 50 years. And they're also forecasted to become more efficient. And like practically Airbus and Boeing are on target to practically achieve about a 25% fuel efficiency improvement in the time which we're looking at. It's very, for me, it's difficult to imagine that they have any tools. So I have heard rumors that there could be that aircraft manufacturers, there would be ways to incentivize them further towards using other technologies to achieve even better fuel efficiency, maybe even testing new aircraft designs. But we know that practically in the gamble or in the big game between this duopoly, any wrong move can be extremely risky, right? I mean, we've seen what happened to Boeing with the Dreamliner, and you can imagine practically on an industrial scale politics, these kind of gambles which you have to take with new technologies which are completely untested. It's very difficult to see the big stakeholders moving in that direction from my perspective. And so what they're going to do is practically gradually improving fuel efficiency with the technologies which are going to be available to them. And that means that they're not going to be able to give aircrafts to aviation stakeholders which are going to have sufficient technological advances which can guarantee net zero CO2 by 2050. Because if you're considering average aircraft in the European Union is between 22.5 to 25 years long, operational within the EU, and is then practically sold to a secondary market. The value of the secondary market is also highly important towards the technology which you can try. So if you produce an airplane which can only be flown in the European Union, it becomes practically worthless at the end of the half-life of its practically of the airframe. So if you cannot practically at the moment see how the aircraft companies can in a sufficient quantity supply airplanes that practically have technology advantage so high that CO2 savings can be achieved in that, then the question is, what do you left with? And then you're like practically left with negative emissions technologies. And negative emission technologies, I mean, I'm no expert on that, but like practically from what I've seen is that a lot of this is in the children's shoes. DAX is in the trial phase. The costs which we're seeing are very high at the moment. And yes, they're going to be reduced. But when you're looking at the global available practically gigaton savings, about 5 gigatons by 2050, and practically in what percentage of that would be eaten up by aviation, then yes, from the European aviation standpoint, this is not the majority of it. It's actually quite a small percentage. But if you're thinking about that, if you're banking on nets, negative emission technology, then you're practically banking on a risk, because you're banking on a price factor which you only know from theoretical studies. And if you don't want to go the pathway and say like, hey, wait a minute, we're going to take a bunch of this like practically net technology, which we know has very negative impact on the environment, such as BECCS and other advanced weathering techniques, then practically you like have a very small technological pathway which you're giving yourself with a very restricted supply, which is hypothetical. And then I would say it's a risky path, because like practically that price, while you have practically forecast studies, could be 3 times as much. And then all of a sudden you're way beyond the SAF level. So that's practically timing. The other point is that practically I see SAF, and Steph, you're making this argument as well. So practically SAF would anyway, right, become part of, even if you just let EU ETS run and say like, oh, good, guys, you do whichever technology you want. I mean, they would be forced to do, in my opinion, SAF anyways, but practically you would have this feeling that like aviation stakeholders would be going to the industry saying like, hey guys, we would love to buy SAF because we know we have to pay EU ETS. And maybe this goes well, but maybe also the industry comes back and says like, guys, no, we're very sorry, we didn't build the production facilities because we didn't trust any of this. You know, and then you're in a hard place, between a rock and a hard place. And so I see SAF, the support which you have of a blending mandate is more of an incentive schemes and practically trying to give a long-term perspective to the industrial stakeholders to show those developments. And as such, it's practically, it's like reducing some risks to the sector which have been delaying any climate actions. So this is how I see it. I'm not saying your argument is wrong, Steph, not at all. I just see that the blending mandate for me is more of a signaling function, right? And it is not really, I haven't come across a lot of technologies which are not very hypothetical, which would give us the level which SAF would give us, the level of practically ability to decarbonize. I'll keep it there. So, yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for that. I think your points pretty much open up discussions on 2 points. Maybe the first being, well, what level of certainty do we actually need in the industry to also invite producers of SAF to actually be able to scale up production and make the investments that are necessary to actually fulfill the blending mandates that we have now in the European regulation. So I think that is one of the points that you have here. And I think the other one, and I think that's also the point that Steph was probably making, well, as long as ETS allowances are more expensive than putting SAF in your aircraft, then we're going to end up in the same position. But well, we've had quite some questions also on the pricing topic. So we had one question asking, could you explain again why there is only a 30 to 40% increase in ticket prices? Maybe that goes to you, Martin, but maybe we could then afterwards also discuss about, well, what happens to prices, what happens to ticket prices, and then what happens to demand, and how can we see that under different regulatory regimes, especially under SAF, of course?
Steph, do you want to go first, maybe? Or we talked enough?
Well, just go ahead. So I'll let you answer the effect on the price of tickets. For the rest, I agree. Of course, there is uncertainty, but it's always like this if you have a main challenge. But I think it's sometimes very wise to keep all technology options open. Remember what we did for the car sector. For the car sector, we have been pushing for biodiesel, biogasoline, all this was the future. And in some countries, it was believed to be the future. And they were all beaten by the development of electric cars. So I'm talking about horizon of 10, 15 years. I know aviation may be a different game. I agree, but we should be careful in just already deciding now what will be the technology that will help us to to decarbonize aviation. I'm going to stop here and let you answer the question, because I think many people want to raise questions, I guess, and want to give them the floor. Thank you.
So maybe to the prices, but I don't see the question in the chat, but I see one regarding like practically all the technological changes or practically factors which are surrounding the aviation industry and practically should go into the price. The answer is, look, our models take into account pricing of technology which goes in. It usually, because practically if you produce stuff at a higher price, it's the price which incorporating the production facilities of that. So you're practically selling it at 3,000 euros a ton, which is a bit high, but like because of practically what goes into this production. And so therefore, if you see it as purchasing stuff from the aviation sector, then practically you already incorporate the steps which lead to you receiving stuff. And there is, of course, other parts of the aviation sector which Destination 2050 and some of our research does not take into account, especially when it comes to airport infrastructure adjustments. However, there is the science that airport infrastructure should probably be addressed separately, and we're seeing a lot of airport infrastructure practically achieving net zero much earlier. However, practically refinement capabilities or practically pipelines which you need for some of the other components to arrive at the airport, yes, this is still practically an outstanding issue which should be looked at. And when it comes towards airplane manufacturing, we do not take into account the CO2 which is being emitted in the process. However, similar to car, CO2 of production of airplanes are a very small fraction of what a CO2 emissions of an airliner, you can imagine, given what they actually do. So yes, practically the ticket prices probably incorporate a large part of this. Then when it comes to somebody writes about what is it about carbon pricing? No, thank you. Do you know about the SAF allowances? Yes, I know a little bit about it. Not a true expert on this, but think about the SAF allowances as they're currently structured or practically ending well before 2030, right? And only an extension of the current regulation would practically mean that SAF allowances would go even past 2028, for example. And the volume of SAF allowances is relatively low in comparison to the overall SAF amounts which you're needing. So what I think this policy is supposed to support is A support to the industry stakeholders, B, to the producers, then practically ranking up or bringing up volume faster than it was before. So again, I think it's more of a signaling. And I think it's designed as an instrument to maybe redistribute the effects of SAF within the European network. Because if you're looking at which are the consumers paying for Fit for 55 regulation, then you realize that some positions within the European Union are less good than others, right? So for example, if you're born on Malta or on one of the other islands, which has a very high share of aviation transportation, then you can imagine that you're probably much more affected by these kind of things than let's say if you're like born in the middle of Germany and and can also take other transport modes which don't have these prices. I think then, and maybe I can answer to the rail thing also because I see it in the chat and then I'll give over. Look, I would love to see the railway sector succeed. I have been wanting them to succeed for the last 25 years, or at least 20 years of my professional life. I have participated in a good number of those programs. Not a lot, but like in a good number. I think that we're seeing very successful railway policy in some number of EU states, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria. We see some other countries dramatically fail towards like policy, which is just subpar. And so the European connectivity which aviation provides is very difficult if you have member states which are practically spectacularly failing, right? So I'm not saying railway cannot be a solution. I'm just saying that railway has at least as long infrastructure horizons which the aviation industry has. And so we should be aware of the limitations of the railway sector, which are somewhat self-funded. So I'm not saying I would be happy as a kind if people would use the rail more. I would be happy if there would be the ability to provide actually high service, reliable train transportation. I'm just saying that in this discussion, I would be very reluctant to say, hey, maybe railway sector is going to come and practically solve the sustainable aviation problem. That one, I think we should be very careful before. Yes, sorry. I always rant, and it's about when it's about rail sector. I always start ranting. Sorry. No.
No worries. Well, I think we have a very interesting question in the chat. Magdalena Holmieser says, what I'm missing a bit in this discussion, we definitely need a strong demand reduction, with or without SAF. Providing fuel substitutes in the planned scale will not be sustainable and lead to land grabbing and conflicts with other sectors. So the question is, will we trust that SAF rules will lead to the reduction? Do we trust in ETS and CORSIA? Or are actually measures to cap flights and reduce frequent flying necessary in order to then only produce the SAF for the rest of the necessary flights? Well, I think that covers a lot of discussions that, of course, are out there. So, well, do we believe in all of this happening? Will we achieve net zero with SAF? And is net zero actually necessary? And what about just capping flights? What is your opinion on that?
Maybe I can have a quick reply on that. I think on that point, and I think my illustrative example was very clear on that, is that if just you include ETS in the price rather than using the SAF mandates with ETS imposed simply ETS and no SAF regulation, you will have a much stronger demand reply than when you have this blending mandate. The blending mandate actually softens the effect on demand. Now, the main question is whether, and that's the second point, I think climate policy in the EU will only succeed if we can do it in a cost-effective way. And to do it in a cost-effective way, I still trust ETS much more than a lot of very sectoral instruments, which in the end, is a lot of lobby work. And the studies I've seen usually make sure that it costs twice as much when you start to just inventing all kind of sectoral instruments. So I think that's my very simple answer to that. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I would love to follow up on Steph, because I agree that EU ETS just by itself is very likely going to be the more effective, or like it's going to be the more costly measure. And if you do something more costly in transportation, then it's also the more effective measure in the sense of that it practically dramatically downscales the sector. I think it's politically unpalpable. We live in a world where we practically over the last 60 or 70 years have highly incentivized people to travel, right? There have been government policies, a vast number of government policies are towards subsidizing travel. It is usually run under the framework of saying that either connecting lagging regions, it's run under practically trade policy, it's run under political integration, you name the reason which you want, and practically you get a transport mobility, something for it. Is it equitable to do so? Questionable. Is it easy to get off this with a very harsh measure which makes transportation much more costly? I think that the recent feedbacks which we're seeing politically towards some of the sustainability measures are partially driven by prices. So I can imagine that you politically practically very quickly end up in a situation where somebody's promising, hey, we can do much, much cheaper flights, and you get people who are voting for that, not thinking about, that's going to be very poor for the environment. So I think that practically stepping away from the massive subsidies, direct, indirect, towards the transport sector at large, right? The cars are included, rail is included. They all got like practically good amount to regularly extend their services. If you do this too quickly, you end up in a situation which I would be quite hesitant to say is much better, because I can easily imagine you have a large pushback. You have a sector practically which is going to completely stand like still and say, like, okay, we're not doing anything if you don't want to play ball. For me, there's a lot of subsidies which are hard to argue for should be still given. I'm thinking, for example, towards the low taxation towards business flights. Like that practically encourages long distance flying, which we know is completely inequitable. And even further, is the mainstay of some of the carbon emissions which we're seeing. So I think if you want to practically make policy changes in one direction, I would probably go towards reducing subsidies in one end, and like maybe then practically go with SAF allowances and like the SAF thing. That I think that's, for me, that's more palpable than practically going only EU ETS and practically stopping flying as we know it, or stopping it under a level which we haven't seen. Because I think that the price changes, if we're going to go only EU ETS, is going to be so high that I could see flight demand decline way beyond the level which was in the early 2010s. Right, so I think it would be really a shock to the sector, and then we should never forget that there's people who are earning their livelihoods with it. The aviation sector has a substantial share of blue-collar workers which are employed in it, similar shares than practically which you're seeing in other transport sectors. If you practically run policies which are damaging these kind of areas, you often, what you're seeing also with farmers, you often run into really problems. Yeah, I think then there was another part of your question which I wanted to. Let's stop with that.
Okay, thanks a lot. There's another question in the chat from William Morrison. It is common for passenger carbon offset schemes to list SAF and R&D investment programs as a possible use of carbon offset revenues collected. How effective is this, particularly as the issues surrounding SAF are so complex? How can passengers understand investing in SAF technology versus alternative certified carbon offset investments? Do you have an opinion?
I can give a quick answer to that. I think usually there's a rule that when we look at R&D, first of all, we have to check whether it has some potential. Secondly, normally what is wise for the government is to just subsidize something like 50% of the investment, and not have an automatic linkage that everything which is paid by permits or taxes goes into R&D. There's absolutely no reason why the revenue of permits or taxes, the total revenue, should be spent on R&D. No, there's no reason. We should really limit efforts, and of course there is no. We tend, and I think in that respect I also disagree with European Commission, that tends to say anything that is any auction revenue from permits has to be invested in climate policy. There's absolutely no reason to do that. There's absolutely, I don't see any economic logic to do this. There is no, you should be able to use the money for many different things, not only for climate policy. There's no reason for that. Of course, maybe it's a political constraint that we have a problem within the EU to spend money or to find money, whatever, and then you get into all kind of mechanisms that are not correct. But we should not believe that this link should be automatic. I hope this is an answer. Thank you.
Martin, do you have anything to add on that? Otherwise, I would go forward with the next question.
No, feel free to go forward. I think that answers great.
Okay. So Achim is asking, well, most of the aviation growth happens in Asia. Well, that of course leads to the question, well, we have a global market that of course is global due to the way it is set up, but we have sub-global regulations. So we have initiatives in the US, we have initiatives in Europe. How does it work? who pays for mitigating the climate impact of aviation, and where do we see the growth, and how does all of that fit together?
Maybe if I can start, and Steph, you can say what I probably most likely forget. So yes, the share of aviation emissions globally from the EU is just a small share of it. And so practically things which are happening outside are highly relevant if you want to decarbonize globally. We see goals being set in Asia, in the US. Their policies are mostly SAF from what I can tell, right? Like, I mean, practically we have a much stronger policy mix. We have seen much more forecasted price increases than the other world regions. That's also what's leading to some of those competitive discussions. It directly links also to the discussion about CORSIA. I mean, China, US doesn't participate, didn't sign up for it yet. It's very unlikely that they're going to sign up. If they don't sign up, what's the point of the whole thing? That's very difficult to see. Are they going to maybe go their own route? Is there going to be less cooperation on this? What is the competition effect? All very, very good questions. But I think, and that was one of the earlier questions, which was only touched upon slightly, is what is practically those, how can you see those practically measures under CORSIA, where it's practically those carbon abatement measures or like practically certified carbon offsets? Now, I see them as very problematic. Like there is maybe some high quality ones which can arguably use, but if I see somebody planting a forest and then that forest burning due to climate change, there is zero CO2 saved from that. So I think that, and there have been relatively good recent studies which show that a lot of the carbon offsets measures which we're seeing are not suitable to the aim. Yeah. Steph, do you want to add to that?
You're still on mute.
So, okay, thank you. I agree, there's a problem of coordination, but that holds for most of EU climate policy. I think Europe is kind of leading and putting the example. We will need some kind of border taxes to make a very strong climate policy work, and this in the end, so also these border taxes can only work if we have a coalition that is sufficiently large. So we need to have at least also the US together with us. Then it can work. If EU is the only one to come up with border taxes, that will be, we will still be able to reduce carbon emissions. But okay, it will be not so effective for the world. I still believe that the main story, if we want to convince the world to reduce emissions, is that we have to offer them technologies that make it much cheaper. And for that reason, I believe that we should give a disproportional importance, not on SAF, but on more fuel-efficient aircrafts. Like imagine, so if you look at photovoltaics, if you look at GARS, the things that will change the world are much better technology, pushed by very high expected carbon prices. I know in the EU, but that looks like one of the winning policies. Sorry, took too long.
Yeah, I fully agree with Steph on this one. Oh, sorry, Anna, do you go?
No, you go first, because then I'm going to go for the last question and ask you to round it off. So if you have something to say, go ahead.
Do it already. No, I'm going to agree that like practically all the upcoming policies which we're seeing, CBAM, or like the possibility from CBAM, RED 3, CORSIA, further developments, that's going to be very interesting over the next 5 to 10 years. I want to stay hopeful and that we can practically achieve some sort of compromise which is suitable. It's taken us quite a long time, but with aviation, I'm just a bit hopeful that where we are at the moment. Like, I'm not saying, hey, this is going to go really well, for sure, but I'm saying that at least the policies which we have seen and which are being announced, as long as we can keep them, at least we're going in the right direction. So I think this can be very helpful for the foreseeable future. And also, if I agree with Steph, if we can have a meaningful discussion with practically some of the other large blocs which are running aviation, then there is always hope that we can practically come up with compromises which can serve all parties.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So we're already at the end of our webinar. I would ask both of you to maybe round up in 20 seconds, 30 seconds, what you still want to tell us, what we probably haven't covered so far, if there's anything. And then afterwards, I'll take over again and close everything up. Steph, you want to start?
I think my message is pretty simple. We should not predict too much what technology will be most helpful to reduce emissions in the long term. I think let's rely on ETS to start and give R&D subsidies for the moment to everything which makes aircraft more fuel efficient. I could also make sure that we develop subs that are really carbon neutral and less costly than we have them now. Thank you.
My message is like quickly more of a hope, which I already had from the earlier point. We shouldn't lose the sight of what our end goal is, and we shouldn't let people tell us that something isn't possible because it's too expensive or something like that. We should continue being ambitious, and then we're going to achieve those goals, and everything which we see at the moment is. And so if you hear people saying like, oh my God, it's going to be too expensive, then just have a reasonable amount of mistrust. Thanks for the invitation. It was fantastic talking with you, Steph.
Yeah, so perfect. Thanks a lot. I think that was a very, very interesting discussion. Thanks a lot to our two speakers for joining our webinars. Thank you to everyone else for joining today. I hope you'll be on board again for one of our upcoming webinar sessions. And then, well, as this is a GARS and an EAC event, I wanted to also highlight that EAC is coming up soon, end of November, beginning of December, and I'll just share it briefly here so you can see it. So if you're interested in cargo and the aviation, then feel free to take a look at the current EAC conference taking place November to December. And then thanks a lot.